Hello again, friends. Time for another In Other News. Couple of different stories from a couple of different parts of the planet that have a common theme. I'm going to entitle this one, Pissed Indigenous Peeps Across the Planet. The stories I'm referencing are not making headlines in the United States, as per usual. And they are that in China right now, there's a fairly significant uprising in Tibet and actually the province next door in Sichuan by Tibetan people, perhaps a pro-independent Tibetan people. And in other news, in another country, Australia had a very bizarre attack on their prime minister, perhaps by indigenous Aboriginal folks. What's all this all about? Again, totally unrelated stories, but with a common theme of perhaps oppressed peoples who are suddenly pissed and having a little bit of uprising action. In China, that one, of course, is way more complicated in terms of the kind of pro-free Tibet movement that many of you have bumper stickers on your car about, has been ongoing for, 60 years. Tibet, perhaps 600 or 700 years ago, used to be an independent kind of kingdom. It was absorbed by the Manchu Empire at its height about 600 years ago, so the Chinese consider Tibet part of their territory, and that's kind of the way that the current government sees it, and they're not going to change their policies no matter what. They say, yes, Tibet is part of China, period. It is a sub-state of China, and we will never, ever, ever change our mind on that. That's, of course, what the Chinese say about Taiwan as well. You already know, for those of you who have taken my class, that, I have a tendency to agree with the Chinese government, not because I'm siding up with them or believe they're any more right or wrong than the other side. I am just pragmatic. I'm a realist. And as China's power grows, its claim on these territories solidifies into steel, basically. So what's the dealio with the current events then? Well, there has been, of course, a free Tibet movement ever since about the 1950s, 1960s, when at one point it looked like Tibet was going to achieve independence. During the chaotic period of Chinese history, starting about 1900, the whole state kind of collapsed. They got rid of their dynasty, their whole imperial line. It was a state of civil war for several decades. And in this window of opportunity when the Chinese government was weak, it looked like Tibet was going to be able to pull out and become independent. Some countries actually recognized their independence at that point. But then the Chinese communists won the civil war. They started to reunify the country and started, I believe in 1959, they actually kind of re-invaded Tibet and established Chinese rule there. And it's been that way ever since 1959. There's this dude named the Dalai Lama. I'm sure everybody knows the Lama, the flowing robes, the Tibetan coolness monk, and all that stuff, who has been in exile since that 1959 invasion. He hauled ass across the border over to India. And the Dalai Lama is interesting in that he's kind of a political and spiritual leader, and people know him, Tibetans know him as kind of both. The outside world knows him as this kind of cool Tibetan peace-loving monk who is the head of the world Buddhism movement, all about nonviolence. So he's bestowed with accolades, and he's a peace activist, and that's how the Western world knows him and loves him. He's beloved. And he also advocates for not so much a free Tibet. The Dalai Lama for years has been saying, I don't know, I'm not saying that Tibet needs to be an independent country, but that it needs to have more autonomy. It needs to be respected more by the Chinese, and that we should have a little more self-governance over ourselves. He himself has not been back to Tibet since 1959. And people within Tibet, Tibetans, actually see the Dalai Lama as a kind of political leader too. And that's why the Chinese government hate him so much, by the way. The Tibetans see him as the leader of Tibet, a political entity, and perhaps some of those people want Tibet to be an independent kingdom. And this is what the Chinese government is never, ever, ever going to allow. So what you've had is on again, off again, smaller kind of uprisings in Tibet for 60 years that have not amounted to a whole heck of a lot. And I should also add in here, Tibetans, we're calling them Tibet, is a political entity, a sub-state of China. Tibetan people are a different ethnicity. There's Han Chinese people. When you consider Chinese people, that's actually Han Chinese people, that ethnic group. Tibetans are not Chinese people. Neither are the Uyghurs up in the northwestern part of China, neither are Mongolians in the central northern part of China. So it's a different ethnic group altogether, and it's a fairly small minority group within China because the vast majority of people in China are Chinese people. Go figure. Anyway, back to the story. Oh, and I want to put this disclaimer in here as well. Most Chinese people do not like the Dalai Lama, do see him as a terrorist almost, who's inciting riots, who's inciting a Free Tibet movement that's trying to pull Tibet away from China proper. That's the official Chinese government's opinion, by the way, as well. They hate the Dalai Lama. They are going to crush any kind of Free Tibet movement. But I do want you to understand that a billion Chinese people see it that way too. So there's not a lot of love or support for the Dalai Lama within China in a broader context, not just the Chinese government. So what's been going on is mostly low-level pro-independence stuff for years in Tibet that's not amounted to a whole lot. And the Dalai Lama himself, who does worldwide tours pretty much his whole life, talking about Buddhism, but also the Tibetan movement to preserve their culture and to get perhaps political autonomy or a little more political autonomy. That's been going on for a long time. The actual kind of protest uprising for the first time for a long time got hot back in 2008. And this was quite intentional. Just before the Chinese held their Olympics, the World Olympics, it was going to be China's coming out party, and they were going to, all this national pride is welling up. And by the way, you know the end of the story. They won the damn Olympics, and it was a great, huge success for the Chinese government. However, the Tibetans, some Tibetans, decided to use that window when the world was focusing on China to start to have street protests and have uprisings and perhaps protest the Chinese government's involvement in Tibet and lots of other things. And the uprising did turn violent on both sides. Anytime there's any sort of Tibetan uprising or a Uyghur uprising in the northwest or a Mongolian uprising in Inner Mongolia and north central, the Chinese response is always the same, which is send in hell tons of troops and crush it. China, of course, controls all news sources out of China, so all the stories you're ever going to hear about uprisings anywhere in China by minority groups are strictly controlled by the Chinese press and the Chinese government. So you're only ever going to get kind of one side of the story on any of that action that's happening as well. The Chinese government, for their part, and all of these uprisings will say, we didn't do anything. The Chinese government's completely innocent. We're all lambs. We were just sitting there, and then a bunch of Tibetans came and attacked us and knifed us and started attacking the police and ambulances. That story is the same story they play for every uprising that ever happened. So not to make fun of the Chinese government, that's just the way it is. The other side, of course, will tell another story of, hey, we were trying to have peaceful protest, and then the Chinese military and police started attacking us. Again, this has been going back and forth. The last big one, the kind of biggest big one for as long as I've been alive, was back in 2008, that was repressed fairly harshly by the Chinese government. And it seems like the ball has started to roll again here just in the last several weeks. If you have seen other news stories referencing this, uprisings and street protests have started to happen in Tibet again. And this time they're spreading a little bit, as they did last time, but spreading a little bit outside of Tibet proper. Again, Tibet's a province. But the main violence that's occurred in just in the last several days has actually happened in Sichuan province, right? It's next door. Sichuan, I know you probably heard of Sichuan. There's probably a Chinese restaurant near you named Sichuan. And it's another major province with its own cuisine that has some Tibetan minorities in it. And that's where a lot of repression and stuff is going on right this second. Again, Tibetans uprising, perhaps petitioning for a free Tibet, and being crushed by Chinese military and police. Now, the question then becomes, why is this happening right now? And I do want to alert you to the situation of why this is a particularly chaotic time for this pro-Tibetan movement, why it might be happening right this second. And the answer, in my mind, or at least partly, is that this is an age of transition right now. We're living through this year. 2012 is a transition year for all of this action. What action am I talking about? Leadership is changing everywhere, and anytime leadership is changing is when things are unknown. The future's a little unknown. Future policy's a little unknown, and that's when things are a little tense. And maybe it's the time to exploit things and flush things out and have protests and see what happens. The transitions I'm talking about are the Chinese leadership is due up to step down this year. 2012, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the Communist Party leaders that have been in charge of China for like 8 years or 10 years, it's an age of transition. They're stepping down and new leadership is going to come up. The guy who's probably going to win, who's going to be the next president of China is Xi Jinping, but that's a different story for now. So maybe this is a right time to start protesting, to have the Chinese government think about future policy towards Tibet. My personal opinion is they're not going to change it, but it's this era of change. But also, not just the Chinese leadership is changing, the Dalai Lama himself is stepping down. He already officially has. He kind of said, I'm going to step down as the political head of Tibet, or the political leader of Tibet proper, even though he hasn't been there since 1959. He's still kind of the official head of state. However that works for a place that's not a state, he's been the kind of head honcho of the Tibetan movement for greater autonomy / independence, depending upon who you ask. He has stepped down from that position, or is in the process. Someone is going to take his place. Plus, the dude is old, and the Chinese government knows this. And the way that the Lama system works is that when he gets close to death, or perhaps already, maybe several years out from death, a child will be born somewhere that's going to take on his soul in reincarnation and be the next Lama, right? It's a reincarnation deal. The Chinese government, for their part, have said, oh, we already have the next Lama. We found a Chinese kid who's going to be the next Dalai Lama. And everybody in Tibet's, of course, going, that's BS. We're the ones who are going to get to pick who the Dalai Lama is. And the Tibetan monks themselves are like, oh, we're the ones who will decide who's the reincarnated Dalai Lama. So you have that friction and that action also ramping up, that maybe this old guy is going to pass soon, and who's going to be the next Dalai Lama is already a source of contention between the Tibetans and the Chinese government. The Chinese government, of course, want their pick to be the guy, and they already have him groomed and going to put him in place basically as a puppet. All right? So that's going on in China right now, era of transition of leadership that may be causing this kind of unsettled, hey, this is the time to step up for perhaps an independent Tibet, or whatever else is that people are protesting about. Greater autonomy or greater rights in Tibet for Tibetans. The other pissed off Indigenous Peeps story that is bizarre, but happening today, just like the Chinese clashes are happening this week today. The other story is from Australia, a fairly tame country by most stretches of the imagination. However, they also have indigenous issues with this group called the Aboriginals. You guys know Aboriginal. I know you've seen Walkabout and all the other Australian movies. This is a group of people, not unlike the Native Americans, the Amerindians in North America, the original people that were there before the whiteys from Europe showed up. And the Australian government's relationship with Aboriginals has been fairly bad for most of their 200-year history. In terms of, much like Amerindians in the United States, they've been fairly repressed, not a lot of rights for most of their history, pushed off their land, made them sign bogus peace treaties that amounted to nothing. So the history between the Australian government and Aboriginals is not great, okay? For those of you in my class, you've seen Rabbit-Proof Fence, where they had the government had an official policy where they could take Aboriginal kids and take them from their parents and mothers and put them with white families. So a very discriminatory, very negative stereotype situation from the Australian government to Aboriginal peeps for a long time. However, in the modern era, things have seemingly gotten better. They had an Aboriginal person led the Olympic parade for the Australians at the Chinese Olympics. Oh, see how I tie them all together? The former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, actually in his first days in office, made an official Australian government apology to Aboriginal peoples. They tried to, I believe, they made a good faith effort to try to establish better relations with the Aboriginal people and maybe supplement some of the past atrocities with a better welfare system or better education. They've made public efforts to make things better between the white Australians, the government, and the Aboriginal folks. So why am I bringing this up right now? Because Julia Gillard, the current Prime Minister of Australia, was attacked by Aboriginals yesterday. I'm using attacked in quotes because it's just bizarre. The whole situation reeks. Apparently, Prime Minister Julia Gillard was at a Australia Day celebration at some restaurant, and Australia Day is celebrating the day that the whiteys showed up from Europe. So a particularly sensitive day for Aboriginal folks who call it Invasion Day, as you might imagine. And they have a negative connotation with that, but the white Australians were celebrating Australia Day at a restaurant, handing out awards to, I guess, white people, I don't know. And a bunch of Aboriginal rights groups showed up and started protesting and beating on the windows outside of the restaurant, and which in and of itself doesn't seem that scary. But somehow it turned violent. That's what all the press releases are saying. It turned violent. And by violent, nobody got hurt. Nobody threw any rocks or anything, but they said, no, it turned violent. And so they had to have Australian National Guardsmen or military show up in force and police with bulletproof shields, and they busted in and rushed the Prime Minister out, and in the rush to rush her out, actually the security guards and people had knocked the damn poor woman down, and were picking her up. Go Google pictures of her, and they're like dragging her to a car and stuffing her in there, and there's cops that were going, ah! And it's like, if you go look at the video, it's an army of police and reporters all around the Prime Minister protecting her from nobody knows. So it's a really bizarre event. It came out today that a media person for the Prime Minister's office is the one who leaked her location and schedule to this Australian group, Australian Aboriginal rights group, basically tipped them off trying to create a situation, which is exactly what happened. No one knows why the guy did it, so he was already fired. So it's just a very bizarre situation all the way around. But, again, related and brings to the forefront, I'm always trying to teach about what's going on in the world, brings to the forefront that even though we consider Australia an awesome democracy, and a rich country, developed, awesome liberal democracy, like the United States, they still have native rights and Aboriginal issues as well. And they try to deal with them better than, say, China does, okay? But they still got them. It's still a touchy subject within Australian society. And we're going to follow these events the rest of this week, because this may touch off a firestorm of protest on both sides. This video, of course, is infuriating maybe other government people or other white Australians who are like, what is this? These Aboriginals attacked our Prime Minister, and the counter responses from Aboriginal groups and other folks are like, this is all staged nonsense. What is this? So I just wanted to bring it up again. Two different parts of the world, both about similar issues about rights for minority groups within these bigger and rich societies. That, you know what, no matter how big and how powerful you get, things like this are still very current events and very real issues that these governments have to deal with. The Chinese and the Australians are dealing with them in different ways. But lo and behold, an issue that has not been an issue in either place. The Tibetan issue has not been a big deal to China, and the Aboriginal issue has not been a big deal to Australians in recent memory. All of a sudden, this week, they're back on the front burner, baby. All the best to Prime Minister Julia Gillard. I'm glad she survived the big attack of people knocking on a window. All that Aussie redhead hottie. All right, that's all for now, though. If you have comments or questions, please, as always, dial them in, write them in to the comment section here. And that's all I got for you in other news with these Indigenous pissed peeps.